This is the final lesson that I've prepared for this particular mini-series regarding awake and not woke. And today we're looking at what I call thought and speech control. Next week, Lord willing, we'll be back in the book of Kings looking at life lessons from the kings. And so we'll go in that direction beginning next week. So thought and speech controlled. I would like to begin, first of all, thinking about the founders. It's an amazing thing that almost every single founding father, and the founding fathers number about 250 of them, almost every single one of them that spoke on the topic of freedom connected freedom and liberty with Christianity. Now that is a strange sound in the ears of modern people. That is a weird sound to the professors and people in the educational field today. Because today, freedom and liberty is almost always connected, at least in their thoughts, with secularism, away from Christianity. Consequently, when they go back to the founders, and if we go back to the founding generation and read this material, it comes with no little shock that the founding generation understood freedom and liberty and connected it always with Christianity, biblical Christianity. But what happens? Because of that connection, modernists today, that is in the universities and even in the colleges, universities, and also in the high schools and elementary schools, connecting it with secularism, what they do is do two things with it. Number one, they glide over or ignore the founding generation and what they had to say on the topic. Or number two, they attack the founders. For example, when they glide over it, that is, we're presented as the founders would be Puritans with people wearing funny hats and having peculiar ideas and some kind of staunch ideas of morality and very unloving and unkind. And that's how they present the founders. Or they might attack the founders. They say, well, the founders had slaves and the founders did this and the founders did that. So one of those two methods is what they use. They also, of course, utilize, and I would classify this in the second category, and that is they attack Christianity by saying, well, look here, Christianity through the centuries, the Middle Ages, actually criminalized people, penalized them, and persecuted them. And of course they make the grand mistake, which so many people do today in modern education, and they want to equate Christianity from the Bible with the Roman Catholic Church. And I say, first of all, number one, they're not very closely akin at all. There's very little in common with New Testament Christianity and the Roman Catholic Church that came about because we have the wedding of state and the church together. That's what happened with Catholicism. And Catholicism indeed persecuted people, but that has nothing to do with New Testament Christianity. So because of that purposeful misteaching, and sometimes it's not purposeful, but it is a complete misteaching, today we are connecting, or people today connect, freedom with secularism, and that is far from the truth. The truth of the matter is that the founding generation understood the principles of Christianity, and they understood that freedom, political freedom, freedom in religion, comes from the principles of Jesus Christ. And so number one, what I would like to do is simply to skim through just two or three of the statements, actually about 5 or 6 of the statements of the founders, just to get us acquainted with a little bit about what the founders had to say regarding freedom and Christianity. This is James Otis in 1761. We mentioned him in one of the earlier lessons. James Otis was, of course, he who was the lawyer in Boston, Massachusetts, and the case was regarding, remember, they had gone through the warehouses and they were searching all the goodies of the people. And so in that particular case, and the intolerable acts that had been passed by England, James Otis was a spokesman for the colonies, and he made this comment: has a government any solid foundation, any chief cornerstone? I think it has an everlasting foundation in the unchangeable will of God, the author of nature, whose laws never vary. That is, there's no changing in God's laws. We'll come back to that idea later. Government is by no means an arbitrary thing depending merely on compact or human will for existence. That is, Government is not simply an agreement between people, but he says there's something else involved. The power of God Almighty is the only power that can properly and strictly be called supreme and absolute. The sum of my argument is that civil government is of God, and that the administration of it were originally the whole people. Let's notice what George Washington had to say late in life to the Delaware Indians. He said, "You do well to wish to learn our arts and the ways of life, and above all, the religion of Jesus Christ." The founders connected freedom and liberty with not simply religion, but the religion of Jesus Christ, just as the passage that was read in your hearing a moment ago. The Spirit of the Lord, or where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. 2 Corinthians 3 and verse 17. John Adams wrote to Jefferson, went too fast. I think the year is 1823 actually. The general principles on which John Adams would write, by the way, he was an intensely religious man, declared that he was a Christian. He said the general principles on which the fathers achieved independence were the general principles of Christianity. That statement right there wouldn't even fly today in modern schools. I will avow that I then believed and now believe that those general principles of Christianity are as eternal and immutable as the existence and attributes of God. That those principles of liberty are as unalterable as human nature. Strong statement from the second President of the United States. Here's Benjamin Rush. Benjamin Rush was an intensely religious man, signed the Declaration of Independence. He made the comment, the only foundation for a useful education in a republic is to be laid in religion. The religion of which he speaks, of course, is Christianity. Without this, there can be no virtue. Without virtue, there can be no liberty. And liberty is the object of life of all republican governments. Without religion, I believe mankind does real mischief to the morals and principles of mankind. And here's even Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, I wanted to add because many people mistakenly suppose that he was a deist, and that is the idea that God has nothing to do with the world. Here's how Jefferson worded it. Can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis? What is that basis, Mr. Jefferson? A conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God, that they are not to be violated but with His wrath. Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, and that His justice does not sleep forever. And he was reflecting upon the institution of slavery when he made that comment. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court in the 1830s made this comment. No free government now exists in the world unless where Christianity is acknowledged and is the religion of the country. No free government. The Supreme Court of the United States in 1831 declared in one of their findings, we are a Christian people. 1844, Providence has given to our people, said the Supreme Court, the choice of their rulers. It is the duty as well as the privilege and interest of our Christian nation to select and prefer Christians as rulers. 1892, in the case which was called the Holy Trinity case, Christianity, said the Supreme Court, is a part of the common law of the land. And they went through a litany of historical events and precedences to show that this is a Christian nation, that is to say, founded upon Christian principles. That was then. Today, it is a little different. That is at least the way people think about it. Despotism is always connected to atheism. I want you to think about this for just a moment. Every single governing system in history, without exception, that does not base itself upon Christian principles is a totalitarian and despotic government. I want to say that once more. Every single governing system in the history of mankind, without exception, that does not base itself upon the principles of Christianity is a despotic and a totalitarian government, such as communism is. It is always that way. And the reasons are not hard to find, even though many professors claim they cannot find them. Because if there is no eternal, immutable standard for what is right and wrong, then everything becomes a murky gray. And if there is no eternal standard of what is right and wrong, there is no eternal value or no eternal basis on which to ground the value of a human being. And if there's no ground upon which to ground the value of a human being, there's no basis for it, then there's no reason that a despotic government should not exist, that coercion should not be the case. Only when we have an eternal, immutable standard of right and wrong, such as that which the Bible provides, can freedom exist. And that is always the case without exception. And we've seen in our country the very statements that I've made have come to pass. The value of human beings is not considered at all any kind of value at all, really, but simply on the same level of animals and plants and rocks and dirt. Because we have jettisoned at the top levels of our government principles from Christ. That's why. And that's what's happening. And despotism, totalitarianism, is always the end result. Let's compare for just a moment critical thinking to critical theory. What do I mean by critical thinking? Critical thinking is drawing conclusions that are warranted by the evidence. That's on the left side of the chart. That is to say, we follow the law of rationality. It recognizes that we are rational beings, created in the image of God, and rationality is one of those concepts that is embedded in us, that is a thumbprint of God upon us. And so the law of rationality is that we are drawing conclusions that are warranted by the evidence. And evidence is that which we study and present and notice and we examine. Science comes out of that. Drawing conclusions only warranted by the evidence. But on the other hand, there's critical theory. That's what we're reviewing in this series of lessons. Critical theory is not that at all. It's simply a power play. It begins with atheism, says there is no God, and that everything is a powerful struggle, a struggle for existence in the sense that one movement begets another movement, begets another, and finally communism results. And people are not rational beings, and power is the name of the game. We jettison critical thinking, and you can see it in schools and universities where all they want to do now is shout people down when they're trying to speak. Because it has nothing to do with critical thinking, nothing to do with rational basis or rational debating. It has to do with power and shouting people out of the pulpit. That's what's going on in our country. That's critical theory, and there is a world of difference between them. Let's look at critical thinking for just a moment more. Logic is simply the drawing of conclusions that are warranted by evidence. That's really the law of rationality. And logic is simply the study of the rules of correct argumentation. That is to say, something is correct, drawing a conclusion that is warranted by the evidence, and logic is simply studying, does the conclusion follow from the premises that are laid forth? A major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion, such as iron rusts. Guns are made of iron. Guns rust. Very simple, drawing conclusions that are warranted by the evidence. And rational discussion takes place where logic is enthroned and where logic is obeyed and understood. And so it is a discipline of study, and it's the law of rationality. I want you to think for just a moment, and you might just open the Bible and notice from the book of Acts, this is exactly how Christianity progresses. By appealing to the mind of men and the reasoning capabilities of people. So we read, for example, and these are just small samples, in Acts chapter 6, verses 9 and 10, that Stephen was full of grace and power. And he did mighty signs and wonders among the people. But there stood up some that were of the synagogue of the libertines. Who are they? Libertines were those who were freedmen who had been slaves, and they were Greeks. They are Greek-speaking Jews. There are Grecian Jews, Greek-speaking Jews, and this is all in Jerusalem, and there were Hebrews, that is, those who were homeborn, brought up right there in Jerusalem. So foreigners, Jews, Greek-speaking Jews, and Hebrews, and Stephen is in the Grecian Jewish synagogues. And so some of them stood up who were of the libertines, and others were of the Cyrenians, and also from Alexandria. Where's that? North Africa. North Africa, Cyrene, Libya, and Alexandria, Egypt. They had come into Jerusalem, and he was disputing with them. And we also are told that there were other Jewish people there, Grecian Jews, from Cilicia and Asia. Who do we know from Cilicia? Paul. Paul was from Cilicia. And we know from the succeeding chapter he was there that day. And what does the next line read? The last line of verse 10. And they stood up and they were disputing with Stephen. Disputing is a Greek word, suzuteo, which means we're seeking together. We're debating. We're arguing. Argumentation in logic does not refer to people losing their tempers and yelling at one another. It refers to laying out premises from which a conclusion can be drawn. Now, it is true that the Jews got very angry and they even killed the man before this was over, but argumentation, rational debating is what is taking place. I remember an old-time preacher saying this, and I simply read it. Of course, I did not know him personally, Joe S. Warlick. He debated 399 times champions of denominationalism all over the Brotherhood. He was born in 1866, died in 1941, and he debated 399 times. He's called by the brethren all over the country to come and debate. It doesn't matter whether it was a Baptist, Presbyterian, Methodist. It doesn't matter whether it was Pentecostal, Mormons, Catholics. They would go, and he was among a core of people who did exactly the same thing. But Joe Warlick would say this. He said, let's have a debate, and the first person who gets mad loses. And that's exactly what took place right here. Stephen was disputing. They were debating. Because Christianity appeals to the rational mind. Look at the next passage, Acts 9 and 22. You turn over 2 or 3 pages. And this is when Saul was converted and became Paul, called Paul. We're told that Paul confounded the Jews that dwelt at Damascus. Remember, that's where he was converted, baptized into Christ in Damascus. And he confounded the Jews that dwelt at Damascus, proving that this was the Christ. Now, what does the word proving mean? It means, the word is sumbibazo, which means taking material and laying it beside one another and drawing a conclusion. That is logic. That is argumentation. He's taking the Old Testament passages and the New Testament realities, the resurrection of Christ, and laying them side by side and showing that Jesus, whom they crucified, is the Messiah. And that continues on to the book of Acts. That's exactly how Christianity spread like wildfire. Acts 17, verses 1 through 3, many chapters later. The subject is once again Paul. Paul and others who traveled with him, when they had passed through Amphipolis, Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where was a synagogue of the Jews. And Paul, as his custom was, went in unto them, and for 3 Sabbath days reasoned with them from the Scriptures. Notice what he's doing. He's reasoning with them. That simply means he's appealing to the law of rationality. He's appealing to the rational minds of these Jews. He had reasoned with them from the Scriptures. And then we're told, not only so, but he was proving that Jesus was he who resurrected from the dead. Setting these things together. Opening and alleging, I think, are the words that Luke uses here. Opening and alleging. What does opening mean? It doesn't mean simply opening the scroll upon which they read. It means opening their minds to the facts of the case. Opening and alleging that it behooved the Christ to die and resurrect from the dead. And that this Jesus whom said he, whom I'm preaching to you, is the Messiah. All right, Acts 18:28, 1 page over. Apollos does the same thing. Verse 28 tells us, matter of fact, if we back up to verse 25, we're told that he was powerful in the Scriptures. Boy, wouldn't that be great to be powerful in the Scriptures? And then we come down to verse 28, where he confuted the Jews, strongly opposed the Jews, and he confuted the Jews, showing that Jesus was the Christ. Same thing in Acts 19, verses 8 and 9. Same opening perhaps in your Bible. Here Paul is in Ephesus, and he's kicked out of the synagogue finally, and he comes to the school of Tyrannus. So we're told, as verses 8 and 9 open, that Paul went into the synagogues, he preached, and he reasoned with them from the Scriptures. And then we're told in verse 9 that he went to the school of Tyrannus, reasoning daily with the people. Reasoning. That's Christianity. And so Christianity, I want to say this, Christianity is the only system, the only principle that engenders and allows free open debate, free discussion. Christianity invites opposing views because we're confident that Christianity is defended and is defensible. But when we go to the other side of the ledger, the critical race theory, Marxism, we don't have that at all. Instead, they're following the ideology of Karl Marx. It's all about power, as I mentioned, and there's no free discussion, no open discussion. As a matter of fact, the norm today is if you're a white-skinned person, which everybody in this room is, then the assumption is that you're racist because of your DNA. Now, that has nothing to do with open discussion, no benefit of the doubt. The jury's gone, it's come back with a decision, and you're guilty of racism because of your skin color, because of your DNA. Does that sound like anything that comes out of free, open discussion? Does it sound like it comes out of the law of rationality? No, it doesn't. And people become, in the critical race theory, hypersensitive to every supposed or real offense that has been committed against them, and they're so sensitive about it, you cannot even talk to people anymore. You can't even bring it up in discussion, as I've mentioned before in lessons past. Think about this. The critical theory, the Black Lives Matter website says this. Let me just stop here for a moment. I don't want to pat myself on the back on this or anything such as that. But I do want to call your attention to one thing. There are very few pulpits, few, in the churches of Christ where a preacher is going to mention such things I'm about to mention. They're not going to do it because we have capitulated too much. The Black Lives Matter website says we disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure requirement. I want to know how it's the case that there are people involved in Oklahoma City at the college there, All Brotherhood College, who are defensive of this right here. I want to know how that's the case. I want to know how it is that we have black preachers who are defending Black Lives Matter when this is right there on the front page of the website, or was. How can that possibly be? And I want to know why it is that this is so blatant and bold and so many preachers avoid it like the plague. Why is that the case? It seems to me it's an open shut case. We foster, they say, a queer-affirming network. When we gather, we do so with the intention of freeing ourselves from the tight grip of heteronormative thinking, that is, rational thought. We're going to free ourselves from rational thought. So what's happening? Remember, we're talking about thought and speech control. They're shutting down the Bible. And they're shutting down not simply the Bible, but those who are going to voice what the Bible teaches, such as what we're doing this morning. So, for example, in UCLA, at the college at UCLA, when George Floyd was killed in Minnesota, at UCLA, and of course the riots began to take place, cities began to burn, a UCLA professor refused to put off the tests and the exams for his class, as many minority students demanded that he do because they were so upset about George Floyd. He refused to do it. He lost his job. He lost his job with the college. Alexander Katai is a world-class soccer player. Foreigners, you can gather by his name. His wife criticized Black Lives Matter on social media. He was dismissed from the team. Can't say that. A Canadian cabinet minister lost 3 jobs, including his government job, because he questioned the concepts that homosexuality and the homosexual movement in the agenda is putting out. He questioned whether it's really sexual orientation or not. He lost his cabinet position. Shut your mouth. The Canadian law that was passed this year, January 8th, now enshrines what they wanted, and that is you cannot criticize it, that is the homosexual lifestyle, and you cannot boast of or cannot even further in any way whatsoever what they call conversion therapy. What is conversion therapy? Drop the word therapy off of it and you know what it is. It's conversion. You cannot convert. Who are they wanting that you cannot talk to? Who do they want to shield from conversion? The homosexual agenda, the homosexual community. You cannot try in Canada to convert a homosexual. I want to know, where are people and our preachers talking about the thought and speech control that's going on? But how about more in the United States? Do you know right now 16 states have banned conversion therapy in their government offices? They banned it. And you can guess which states they probably are. Conversion, once again, drop the word therapy off. They're banning conversion. That's shocking to the nth degree, isn't it? The California law, 2018, criminalized certain speech. It was AB 2943. You can look it up. And you know what speech they're talking about. They claim it is consumer fraud. And here's part of the wording of the bill they passed in 2018 in the state of California. It's consumer fraud. The Assembly voted to criminalize a transaction intended to result or that results in the sale of lease of goods or services to any consumer that consists of, okay, what kind of goods and services can you not provide? Advertising, offering to engage in, or engaging in sexual orientation change efforts with an individual. You can't do it. It's against the law in California. I had a man who was a homosexual came into one of my offices when I was in East Texas, and he wanted to know what the Bible taught about it. According to California law, if I had lived there, I would be banned by law from saying anything about it. Are we frightened yet? We should be. It defines sexual orientation change efforts as including efforts to change behaviors or gender expressions or to eliminate or reduce sexual or romantic feelings toward individuals of the same sex. So a person comes into my office and says, I have a problem and I have feelings, romantic feelings toward another person of the same sex. I can't say a word about it. I can't say anything regarding changing that orientation, as they want to call it, at all. If I do, I have now covered by the criminal code. Now that's what's happening in America. The Alliance Defending Freedom tells us this when they commented on this. At its core, AB 2943 outlaws speech, whether offered by a licensed counselor or even a minister or a religious leader. How about the pulpit? Same thing. What do you think preachers ought to do in California? You know what they ought to be doing. It targets a specific message that an adult who is experiencing unwanted same-sex attraction or gender identity confusion, which they're teaching in elementary school, by the way, can find help to address those issues for censorship. That is, we target the specific message that a preacher will give for censorship. The breadth of this censorship is staggering. That is, who are they censoring? Preachers, counselors, biblical counselors. Dr. Robert Gagnon teaches in Houston at a Baptist university, and he said this. Think about it. To sell any materials or offer any counseling for a fee that presents homosexual practice and transgender identity as wrong or a sin, including commentaries on the Bible and exegetical treatments, that is, taking a passage and showing what the passage says, such as Romans 1, which we've done, that affirms a biblical position on these matters, perhaps even the Bible itself, is to incur criminal sanctions in the state of California. So we're going to cut portions of the Bible out. It's already happening in America. They're coming for you. They're coming for me. That's what's happening. They're shutting down free speech. Our own President, Joe Biden, an executive order in June of this year, which covers all government offices, the government which has grown to gigantic proportions, way too large. It urges Congress to pass the Equality Act. What is that? That is to enshrine into law, codified law, everything that we've seen so far. The Equality Act. And he talked about discrimination against homosexuals and bullying that takes place against homosexuals. We'll talk about that in just a moment. And he says we're banning conversion therapy. So if you're in a government office of any kind, and he includes the Federal Trade Commission, Secretaries of State, Treasury, Homeland Security, banning conversion therapy. Ban conversion. You cannot talk about the Bible or the biblical position at all. That's what the President has said, and we're going to get the Equality Act, he said, passed. This was George Bush, as you can see, from 1990, and I'm backing up just a little bit in time just to show, because people ask, when did this begin? How did this start? How did we get so far down the line? Republican President George Bush, the senior. In 1990, he signed the Hate Crimes Statistics Act. It was the first time, and I remember when I was preaching at the time, I read it, I got in the pulpit and talked about it, railed against it, but it was the first time that federal law had provisions for sexual orientation. First time. And hate speech now became a category, because if something is done, if a crime is committed where hate is determined to be the motivating factor, then it has enhanced penalties. Now get it for just a moment. If a crime is committed, there are penalties there, right? But if they determine, that is, officers of the state or the federal government determine that hate was a motivating factor for the committing of that crime, then there's enhanced penalties for it. Now, what has that done? What does it do? Well, it automatically sets hate aside as a specific crime. A crime is a crime. It doesn't need to say, and there's no necessity to say, if a crime is committed with a specific motivation, then it has enhanced penalties. Crimes ought to have penalties, period. But he said no, and you know which community rejoiced in this? The homosexual community. They rejoiced. They pushed it. They've been pushing it for years. Get Hate Crime Statistics Act passed. Why? Because in many cases, they're wiser than serpents, and we are not. And they know exactly how to take down a country. So now what has happened, you can take hate out of that, and hate has become in and of itself a criminal act, depending upon what you say and what you might tweet and what you might say on Facebook. It's a hate crime. Though you have not done anything at all, hate is now a separate crime. And we have George Bush to thank for that one. That's what happened. So it's not simply Democrats. I want to conclude with this one. For many years, the homosexual community was pressuring different organizations in America, including the government, to codify homosexual or same-sex attraction, sexual, what they call now orientation, into law. By the way, the 1990s, 1980s, they would have on job applications sexual preference. I don't know if anybody remembers that. They had preference. They said, we got to get rid of that. Why? No science, nothing to do with science. They said, we're going to have to change it to orientation, because they want you to buy the fact that people are born that way. And so major homosexual organizations, one of them was called the Gay Liberation Front, and it was headed by Frank Kameny. He's pictured in the center there of that stage. They came to the American Psychiatric Association convention that met in San Francisco in 1970 through 1972. And here's basically the timeline of what happened. Prior to 1970, even prior to 1972, homosexuality was declared in the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual as a mental disorder. And psychiatrists around the country, thousands of them, treated it as such. That was, by the way, one step removed from the Bible. It says not a mental disorder. It is sin. But now psychiatry has taken the place of preachers, and the psychiatrist's bed, couch, has taken the place of the pulpit, and so now they say it's simply a mental disorder, not a sin. But that was not satisfactory to the homosexual community. Consequently, in force, under the leadership of Frank Kameny, they came to the APA convention in San Francisco in 1970. Many people don't know about this at all. But this is what they did. They stormed the meeting, they yelled, they held signs up, they intimidated the psychiatrists who came there, and they demanded that homosexuality be removed from the mental illness list in the DSM manual. They demanded it. It was not occurring just yet. 1971. Frank Kameny, he had been in the Army, by the way. He had been an Army doctor. He had practiced homosexuality and been booted from the Army for homosexuality. So he now leads the Gay Liberation Front. They come again in 1971 to the APA convention, and he has a friend on the inside. And that friend's last name is Robinson. Robinson forged credentials so that he could get into the meeting. He gets into the meeting and comes up to the microphone, grabs the microphone, and hollers at all the psychiatrists who represented the world of psychiatry and yells at them and tells them, yelling in the microphone, he says, you better take it off the DSM list of the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual. You better remove it as a mental illness, and we are declaring war against you. Now, let's just stop here for a moment. Let's remember what President Biden has just said. Bullying. Now, we're against individual bullying in any kind of way whatsoever. But the real bullying that's been done is by the homosexual community, bullying the APA to remove it as a mental illness, and bullying preachers and bullying churches to shut your mouth. That's what's going on. The bullying is coming from the other side. And that's how it happened. That was 1971. 1972, they did the same thing. And he not only had his friends on the inside, but they were working from the inside and also the outside. They had a number of people out with placards yelling and hollering at the psychiatrists. And Frank Kameny was invited to participate in a panel discussion, and that's the picture of it right there. One man has a mask on because they didn't want to be identified, and that's him. There on the right, Frank Kameny sitting in the middle. And he's the one who says, we've declared war against you. And so on the panel discussion, he railed about homosexuality not being a mental illness. And finally, 1973, homosexuality was removed from the DSM manual as a mental illness. Science, medicine, no. Hard-knuckle, bare-knuckle, hard-nosed politics, that's what it's all about. And churches are capitulating. They're crumbling at the knees because of it. They're collapsing. I want to read to you as we conclude a statement from Dr. Ronald Boyer. The book is called Homosexuality in American Psychiatry. This is just his foreword, and he's one of them of many that relate the story of Kameny and how they took over the APA convention. He says, regarding the 1973 dispute over homosexuality within the American Psychiatric Association, Kent Robinson, he was one of them that I mentioned there, Charles Sosaridis, and others he gives credits to. In 1973, after several years of bitter dispute, the Board of Trustees of the American Psychiatric Association decided to remove homosexuality from the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Psychiatric Disorders, its official list of mental illnesses. The entire process, from the first confrontation organized by gay demonstrators at psychiatric conventions to the referendum demanded by orthodox psychiatrists, seemed to violate the most basic expectations about how questions of science should be resolved. Instead of being engaged in a sober consideration of data, psychiatrists were swept up in a political controversy. The result was not a conclusion based upon an approximation of scientific truth as dictated by reason, but was instead an action demanded by the ideological temper of the times. And it goes on. It's exactly what happened. That's exactly where we are today. So the reason for this entire series is to see what's taking place and watching our culture collapse beneath us. And it's being done all over the country. And the woke ideology is responsible for what's taking place in America. So we need to be awake. Remember the passage in Ephesians 5 and 14, and that is he tells the Ephesians, I want you to be awake. Awake thou that sleepest, and sleep not. Awake. He wants you to be awake. That is, he wants you to be alert. Alert to the causes of what's taking place, of the collapse in the nation. And in that day, it was the incursion of paganism into the making inroads into Christianity. But today, it is basically the same thing. So awake thou that sleepest, arise from the dead, and Christ shall shine upon thee. I want you to be alert to what is taking place. And arm yourself with the Bible. Remember, Paul wrote, just one chapter later, finally be strong in the Lord and in the strength of His might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you might be able to stand against the wiles, stratagems, that is, of the devil. For our wrestling is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against world rulers of darkness, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in heavenly places. Wherefore, take up the whole armor of God, and having done all, to stand. Christians need to stand for truth, regardless of the consequences. The lesson is yours. The series is completed. The series is yours as well. If you're subject to the invitation in any way, come to the front while we stand and sing.